we're going to look at now how to spot if your child is masking, if you're a parent or carer, or even look into yourself, and things that can be done. If I could just start with you, Jodie, how can parents or carers know that their child is masking?
I think this is a tricky one because I think it will be different for each child. But I've sort of just jotted down a few notes. So if you've got a child who suddenly changes in their expression, and quite often hear parents say, it's as soon as we get to the car, it's as soon as they walk towards me in the playground, it's as soon as we come through the front door, that their child will possibly go into meltdown, become really, really distressed. And I've seen it in my own children where I've had this conversation with lots of parents where you know what sort of day your child has by the child that is walking towards you as they leave class. They say goodbye to their friends and then they're walking towards you, and their facial expression changes instantly. And you know straight away that your child isn't okay. Um, and I think it's really important. I say this to a lot of parents, like, trust your instincts, because if you are an autistic parent of an autistic child and nobody's aware of that, and you're not even aware of that, you will have followed some very neurotypical guidebooks around your child and your parenting. And that goes against your instincts as an autistic parent to autistic children. So we're very often end up on a pathway where we are taught not to trust our instincts, or that our instincts are wrong. So I quite often say to parents, try to, like, I call this rewilding. Like, try to go back to your instincts if you can find them, and try to trust them and speak to other autistic people, parents, communities about what you're experiencing with your child, to sort of try and seek that validation. But yeah, sudden changes in expression and literally a different child from safe place to non-safe place. I suppose it's really important to point out here is that not all children have a safe place. Not all autistic adults have a safe place. And those children will become very internalized, possibly very withdrawn, possibly very not wanting to leave their rooms. Very much like Kieran described, he had his safe haven of his bedroom. So, and actually, looking back to my eldest, when she first started school, she would come in from school and just go to her room. And I remember feeling really, I didn't know she was autistic at this point, really feeling like, oh, I've not seen her all day. And now she's just going to her room. And she was actually doing that to decompress, but didn't recognize that at the time, and sort of trying to sort of coax her out a little bit. But also actually instinctively knowing that she needed that. She needed that downtime. Lots of I'm going to use inverted commas, so refusal, unable to manage their usual social activities due to exhaustion. My youngest, when they did spend some time at preschool, the days where they weren't there, literally could not move them off the sofa. And this was age 3, 4. Couldn't move them off the sofa, didn't want to go anywhere, do anything, just literally needed a screen and the sofa. So you'll see these really high levels of exhaustion in them as well. I don't know whether Kieran or Amy's got anything to add to that.
Or it might look like really like exhaustion, like to flip the other way completely. So it might be, I remember kind of when I was working throughout my 20s, literally coming home and collapsing each day at the end of the day and falling asleep until the evening, and then getting up and, if I could wake up, having something to eat like really late, because there was kind of, that was my narrative there. So so it can look like it's more like recognizing that there is a different state rather than a different kind of behavior or a different this or a different that. It's, my child is one way at school, and then when they're at home they are another way, and there is a tangible noticeable difference there. So it's just being really kind of focusing in on those things, and even things like dysregulation around sensory stuff as well. So if you find during the holidays that actually the there is a difference between their sensory perceptions to while they're at school. So it might be that while they're at school, because they're working harder, their noise might cause them more pain, or they might struggle with that more, or or different smells or different tastes, or whatever. But actually, when you get to the holidays, because they're slightly more relaxed, then those things aren't impacting them on as much, so they're not dysregulated as much. So it's really training yourself to look out for these key differences, and kind of mapping them and keeping a record of those things as well, and actually saying, like, actually, here is my evidence for that there is significant change. You're just not recognizing it as significant change because that's not the lens that you're looking.
So I just wanted to add, thinking about things like routine and regulation. When I spoke to my mum when I was going through the diagnostic process, one of the things she talked about was noticing some of the routines that I set up for myself. So particularly as a teenager, I went to sixth form, which I absolutely loved. It was a great environment, and I thrived there, but I was still always really exhausted when I came home at the end of the day. And she said she remembered one of the things I would do was come home, get changed, put my headphones in, and go straight out for a walk and take myself out by myself, listen to some music, decompress, and then I would come home, I would change into the exact same outfit that I put in every day when I got home from college, because you can't wear the same dirty clothes every day to, socialise with other people, but you can do that in your own house. I would come home, put my uniform on, and then sit and read and just disengage from everything else. And so even though that wasn't maybe as noticeable as Kieran was saying, something like having a meltdown, being able to self-regulate might mean that parents aren't necessarily noticing because you've come up with your own problem-solving strategies. So just being aware of the kind of strategies that your child might use to decompress or to try and, regain some energy at the end of the day, that might be a bit of a cue as to what's going on as well as these kind of maybe more visible signals.
Yeah, absolutely. And my son comes home from work, wraps himself in a duvet and watches telly for 2 hours. And I always used to worry about that. And now I think, well, that's his way of sort of decompressing after the day. Jodie.
Yeah, just following on from what Kieran and Amy said, really, is that I often get called in by parents when a child is masking in school. And I'll go in and do a discrete observation. And I think recognizing that expression change isn't a complete lack of any expression. So schools will say, no, we don't see anything. They're fine when they're here. They're blah, 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 blah. And I'll go in and I'll observe. And it's actually, I think this is possibly linked to double empathy, is that I can observe a child who I know that the teacher has told me is absolutely fine, and I can see that they're not fine. So I can see that rather than wrapping themselves up in a duvet, they're getting their sleeves and they're wrapping it around their arms, or they're fiddling with their fingers underneath the table because on top of the table means that they're going to get told off for fiddling, or they are kicking their shoe on and off of their foot, or they are I could just keep going on if I could empty my brain more effectively. There are so many ways that the expression can change, and it's not always about a complete lack of expression. It's a more discrete stim. Like stims are a form of communication, and I see a lot of that in school from the changes in how a child communicates. So, for example, communication is one that we've not really touched on, but I mask massively in terms of my forms of communication, because when I'm at home with my children or with my partner, we don't necessarily use words. Like we can literally just grunt at each other or make noises at each other, and we all know what each other means. So why, words take a lot of energy for me. I don't believe that they're my first language, and I don't believe that they are for my children either. And I had this actually, sorry, going off a slight tangent. I went into a school to do an observation on a child, and the child was likely autistic, and went up to their TA with their sand-covered hands and just made a noise. And the TA said to the child, "Use your words. What is it you're asking me?" And this is a child who was really very mute in school, very quiet in school, and at home, very bouncy and chatty. And so I said to the TA, you know what he's communicating to you, so can you not, could it would be helpful to him and lessen his anxiety if you accepted that form of communication. You know he doesn't like having messy hands, so he's probably overwhelmed by that sensation, so using words is going to be really tricky for him at that time. So actually accepting that we don't always use words to communicate, but again, because we are able to be verbal, it's expected all the time. Can't remember where I was going back with that, but yeah, going back into schools and doing observations, it's seeing the changes, and it is about teachers and schools and other professionals recognizing how we communicate, and that we don't always communicate distress, overwhelm, excitement through words. Sometimes it does come out in our stims. And I quite often go back and say, actually, I could see that during maths, the child was actually quite distressed, because I could feel it from them, and I could recognize that that stim was a distress stim.
Could you just explain what a stim is, if anybody's not heard that term?
It's a self-stimulating behaviour, is that what it's short for? So it's just a way that we move our bodies, or use our voices, or in order to, I use it a lot to process. So I'm sat here squidging something and picking at my skin, because it helps me process. It helps me make sense of what's in my head and to get it out, because words don't come that easy for me. It can be a way to regulate emotions, so it can be a way for us to feel calmer, or even calm excitement as well, because even excitement can feel quite overwhelming. So I quite often rock when I'm not feeling okay. It's an expression, or it always has a function for me, whether it's calming or processing, mainly my two functions. And it's really common. Almost, I would say, almost all autistic people stim. I think all people stim. We just have different. Again, we express our stims differently, and they're often misjudged. And that's the trouble where there's this sort of overlap sometimes between masking and double empathy, is that these children are still masking, but they are stimming in a way sometimes that would be deemed more socially acceptable. Girls that twiddle with their hair, fiddle with earrings, boys that twiddle with their hair is probably less socially acceptable than girls stimming with their hair. But a lot of people wouldn't necessarily recognise that as a child trying to regulate themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Kieran, did you want to add something?
Perspective. So, as an autistic person surrounded by non-autistic people, as you would generally be as an autistic child in a classroom, all of the people in your class are not experiencing what you're experiencing, including the teacher. So if the teacher's watching you and you are doing exactly what Jodie described, you're expressing your distress in a very suppressed way, and that comes out through like hair fiddling or jigging or fiddling or what, however that looks, the teacher is not going to see that as an expression of distress. They're not going to see that communication. Jodie can walk into a classroom and she can see that as distress because she has also experienced that distress. So it is, she recognizes that behavior. But there's another level of that as well, that if you look at autistic people through a lens of culture, we have our own body language, which is recognizable and relatable to other autistic people. We have our own ways of communicating, which are recognizable and relatable to other autistic people. The way that we exist is recognizable. I can walk down the street and pick out autistic people who probably don't even know that they're autistic themselves, just by the way that they're moving and holding themselves or how they're communicating. So there is a level of empathy that an autistic professional can have in observing autistic children and being able to see things that a non-autistic professional cannot see. That's not to say that the non-autistic professional isn't good at their jobs. It's just that they have limitations because that's not their experience. In the same way that an autistic professional might not recognize distress in another group that isn't autistic. So it works both ways. And this highlights the importance of autistic professionals. in recognizing these narratives, because so many children get missed. Firstly, so many children's distress gets missed by professionals who haven't experienced what those children are experiencing. And we have a narrative at the moment where more and more professionals are becoming what they term as trauma informed. But even that trauma informed way of thinking is still a very mainstream way of how trauma expresses itself. And it ignores neurodivergent expressions of trauma and trauma from other marginalized groups because of the double empathy problem, because there is a level of privilege there that people don't recognize.
Yeah, and what you've stressed here very much is that it's not just for parents and carers to spot when a child is masking, it's for other professionals like teachers and teaching assistants and the medical profession as well.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because parents might be able to recognize it, but of course, then if professionals don't, again, there's a level of hierarchy and power displacement there, because parents don't have the power to actually do anything. They don't have much control over their children's experiences within school. They're reliant on professionals who don't see the problem in the first place and don't see the problems that they create unwittingly through their privilege and their lack of empathy. So, and lack of training and lack of support and so on and so forth. And this can change. This is really simply changed by better training, by better investment in funding and things like that. This can absolutely change, and by promoting autistic professionals to be alongside non-autistic professionals and validating the voices of different marginalized groups. But there's an unwillingness to change because of that privilege and lack of recognizing that there is even a problem in the first place.
I just wanted to sort of bring that back really to what came out of the research that I did. Hang on, I'm just looking through my notes, and it's just literally a scrappy bit of paper, and I can't see where I've written it down. But I know anyway. So, just from the voices of young people that are talking about this stuff, and like Kieran's just described, change isn't like rocket science. The three themes that came out of what young people were asking, or what young people wanted adults to know about masking, or what they wanted to see change, was that they want to be listened to. They want better communication. They want to be involved in the decisions about themselves, and they want empathy. They want it's literally as simple as that. And while I was having this conversation with one young person, and they were so brilliantly articulating this to me, I was sort of started smirking, and then I was like, just to point out, I'm not smirking at you. I'm smirking at the irony. Like, we're both sat here as two autistic people communicating in this way, and we're saying that actually what we want from the non-autistic professionals is empathy and better communication, and yet we're the ones deemed not to have that. And actually opened a really nice conversation for me to talk to them about double empathy. At which point I stopped recording because we'd gone off on a massive tangent. But it isn't rocket science. It really is as simple as that. And if this is coming from autistic young people, it needs to be heard.
It brings you back to what I brought up in the first podcast when we started this conversation around kind of the hubris of humanity, that we all have to be the same and we all have to adhere to the same social standards, the same behavioral standards. We all have to think and feel in the same way. The expressions of our bodies have to be in exactly the same way. There's nearly 8 billion of us. We're not all identical human beings. We're not composite copies of each other. We are all very different, and within that there are groups of people who are very, very different from other groups of people in the way that they think and feel and express and so on. And that's nature. That's biodiversity. It's very, very simple, and it's become the paradigm of neurodiversity, which lots of people are talking about and recognizing now. But within an education system which is framed around conformity, it's framed around teaching everybody in exactly the same way to do exactly the same things and come out at the end of it with exactly the same qualifications. Everything is focused on that perfect human being, that one way of existing. And then you get people who don't fit that narrative, which actually is the majority. There's a very small cohort of people that actually are able to exist perfectly well within a mainstream school setting. And you get people who are neurodivergent or are disabled in some way or have different things going on in their lives or are marginalized from a marginalized group who can't meet that middle of the road kind of need, but they become the problem. They're identified as having deficits. They're identified as having broken bits. And when you talk to lots of professionals about autistic children, it's very much the behavioral lens that they talk through and think through in terms of, well, if we give them social skills training, then they'll act more human. If we give them this, they'll act more human. If they do this, they'll become more human. And it's all about overcoming something which doesn't need to be overcome in the first place if there was just an acceptance that different people exist and different people have different needs. And that's not to say that there aren't certain groups that have disabilities and need extra support. I view being autistic as having a disability. I'm disabled by the barriers that are put in place by society around me, but there are aspects of myself and my being and my neurology which are also disabled, and nothing society does is going to change that. So, but there's an acceptance of that within there, that people are always going to be disabled because we can't meet everybody's needs exactly. But we have to accept that people need different things. But everything in our society, particularly Western society, is framed around the average perfect person that doesn't actually exist. And it's a huge problem. But what that does in the aspects of masking is that enforces masking. But there's another level there, which is actually the recognition that masking isn't the entire narrative here. This isn't autistic people suppressing and hiding themselves and becoming invisible to the naked eye. This is about professionals who do not see things because they are trained not to see things, and they aren't given the full amount of information and training and support in order to be able to see things clearly. So there's two concurrent narratives there. And at the moment, again, all the blame's still put on the autistic person for suppressing and hiding and blah, 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 when in actual fact, we need people who are going to open their eyes and see the things that are right in front of them.
Absolutely. And in this kind of context that you've described so well there, how could a parent or a carer broach this with a child and help them? What can they do to help them?
Oh my gosh! I mean, that's massive. There needs to be so much change, and it's not really just possible for that puts so much onus on the child to take on the world. As a parent, advocating for your child strongly is really, really important, but equally very difficult. Normalizing, giving them that safe space, make sure that at least at home they have that acceptance that that you as a parent have that understanding, that curiosity around their presentation, that curiosity around the meltdowns and the jittery hyper child that comes out of school and is like a Tasmanian devil around your house. And explaining that to them, as a parent, you go on this journey of understanding of your child. You go on these talks and you listen to people and you read books. That's not always that we're not always great at passing that information on to our children. So we're going on this journey of discovery about them, not with them. But talking, saying, I can see that you're not feeling good. Like having, I always talk about the PACE approach, which is designed for trauma children. If you've got a child that masks, there's a level of trauma there. So having that playfulness, that acceptance, that curiosity, that empathy around your child and going on that journey with them. And that will be bespoke to every child. Every child communicates differently and has different needs and presents differently. Starting with that one safe space, and and the people that you allow into that safe space. And this is a really difficult conversation sometimes for me to have with parents when they're talking about, oh, but grandma comes over and she makes these comments, or then this, that, and the other. And I'm like, that person's not safe at the moment for your child, because they're actually adding to the trauma and the damage and the their self-esteem, and all of that. They're not building your child up, and they're not supporting you. To the point where I developed a talk. I had so many parents coming to me saying, could you do a session with my mum, or could you do a session with auntie so and so, or could you do a session with granddad, or whatever. And I just developed a talk that I was like, here we go, just send them this. And it turns into a bit of a plea, because I come in it from a parent myself, where I'm like, actually, we need you to be somebody that we can trust with our children, and that our child can trust to be safe and accepted around you. And if you have got people in your life that aren't ready to do that, or aren't able to do that, then you have to put your child's well-being first. And you have to say, I'm basically avoid them, or don't invite them around, or don't allow them into your child's safe space. But extending on that, we would love schools to be safe places for all children. Unfortunately, they're not, and we know how difficult it is to advocate for their needs in those environments that, like Kieran said, aren't set up for anything but this one type of person.
Yeah, thank you. And Kieran, you wanted to add to that?
Some children don't learn not to say it, but but then get punished for saying it. And having boundary, all of us as adults have, I would imagine, all of us in this room, I know two people quite well in this room, that we've grown up into adults that actually have really struggled with boundaries with other people, and struggled with relationships, and cutting people who are harmful to us and who cause us problems out of our lives. And that's because we were never taught as children what good boundaries are and what healthy, respectful boundaries are. We were taught as children, do as your parents say, do as your teachers say, do as this, do as that. We're not bringing up children. We are bringing up people who are going to be adults. And we want our adults to have healthy relationships with people. We want our adults to have good mental health. We want our adults to have autonomy and control over their lives, and to be able to be authentic, not to the point of impinging on other people's authenticness, but to have respect for other people's boundaries as well, and to be whole like that. But we don't do that. That's not what we do. We put boundaries in with children to stop them from doing left X, Y, and Z. And even when it comes to getting that diagnosis, as parents, it's not our children who are given a diagnosis. We are handed a diagnosis as parents of our children. And then we are expected to go and explain that to our children. Now, I'm fortunately of the privilege where I understand these narratives and can explain it to my children in a way which they can understand, and has helped them and supported them. I know Jodie has done exactly the same thing as her children have grown older, and Jodie's understanding has changed around that as well. But so many parents out there only have the myths, only have the stereotypes, only are handed the negativity. And often those myths and stereotypes and negativity conflict with their actual feelings about their children, who know that their children aren't the stereotype, know that their children aren't negative and aren't expressing bad behavior and stuff like that, that their children are distressed and dysregulated. But their parents aren't armed with the right information in order to be able to support them properly. And they're not surrounded by professionals who have the knowledge to be able to support the parents and then the children properly. So, like Jodie, working with someone else, I've developed a training program for children and for parents, for parents to go through with their kids, to a basic version of my kind of big adult course that guides them through the different parts of what it means to be autistic, and what people will think about you and how they define you and stuff like that. Because nobody's ever done that before, which is absolutely crackers. Why has nobody done anything to support the child? The only support, and I say that word in inverted commas, that's given to children is training for them not to be autistic, is training for them to be inauthentic and not have autonomy and agency, but to actually say, you being who you are isn't good enough. We need you to act like all these other people over here. And there's a fundamental flaw in that, and how the world is not recognizing this, it pains me, because it's so simple and obvious, but yet the world seems to overcomplicate everything and wants people to suffer, I think.
Thank you. And as you rightly point out, I'm saying, what can parents and carers do? And you're saying, well, the onus isn't, just on them. It's society as a whole. So just to wrap up, perhaps Amy, if you could just say, what would you like to see change in a concrete way that might sort of alleviate the kind of things we've been talking about this morning?
It's an excellent question, and one I think that has a really big answer. Not big in terms of long, but big in terms of it's an exponentially huge thing to deal with, which is change the way people approach difference. One of the things that Jodie mentioned earlier on, and that we've certainly found in our work, is that when we talk about people, regardless of whether we know they're autistic or not, or, you know, kind of neurodivergent or disabled or different, one of the things we often hear is that person is weird. And there's a connotation there that that's bad, that weirdness is bad, and that being similar to other people is something desirable. And actually, we need to make space for people to be weird, for people to act in ways that is different or a little bit strange, or unexpected, as long as those people are not actively harming others with the things that they are doing and the ways that they're existing in the world. If we make it more acceptable to be weird, it doesn't necessarily matter whether that person has a label or not, or a diagnosis, because there is space for them to be themselves and to explore what that means. And I think that we can do, you know, as many educational sessions with people, we can have campaigns about awareness, but actually what we need is not to just go, you know, you shouldn't pick on autistic people or victimize autistic people. It's that you shouldn't victimize anyone for being different. That's not what we need to be doing. And if we do treat people like it's okay to be you, I think that will go a long way to changing society, which is a huge thing to do. But I think, you know, we can try.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Jodie. And thank you, Kieran, for all your insight and expertise and knowledge. I found it fascinating, and I'm sure everybody else will too.